Well, hey, I'm Kimberly Dark, and I'm a writer and sociologist and storyteller. And, I'm once again bringing you some simple answers about complex social issues that you might want to know more about, or you might already be talking to people about, which is great. And as usual, I don't have all the answers. I don't even have the only right answers, but I'll spend some time each week doing what I can to address a few things, because I think it is hopeful when more people can join public conversations. And it's hard for folks to do that if they don't even know how to get into the conversation or don't feel like they know enough about the issues. So we are talking about two topics this week. That actually are related, but I'll get to that in a minute. One of them is Black wealth suppression, and the other is school vouchers, which some people think are a great idea and other people don't. And so I'll say something about how the quest for school vouchers came to be, and some of the issues on both sides of that. So that's a conversation you can have with others if you would like. So I'm going to share screen with you so that we can talk about Black wealth suppression. And Emily can also share this image with you so that you can download it and use it yourself. So this is an image that my assistant Rebecca Rubenstein and I created regarding Black wealth suppression. And so I know for sure you have permission to share it and use it because it is mine. I feel like I'm gonna say the thing I always say here, which is, do y'all realize we had chattel slavery in this country for 250 years? Like almost 250 years. And that affects literally everything we do. And part of the reason it affects literally everything we do in 2020 is because, wow, we have never adequately handled the fact that we had chattel slavery, which meant that from generation to generation, human beings were property, and any sadistic thing that a slave owner chose to do was allowable. And so this is really tricky, right? When slavery became illegal, people didn't just suddenly start thinking about this group of humans that they had treated as their livestock. Actually, there's evidence that, those slaves were actually treated worse than the animals that worked on those same properties. But they didn't suddenly start thinking about those folks as human beings. They still didn't want them living as neighbors or, going to schools or collecting pay, let alone accumulating wealth. And this is what we're talking about here. The suppression of Black wealth makes sense. It makes sense that this has been the norm in the United States, but holy crap, it has to stop. And we have to figure out how we, as a culture, and especially as a government with, systemic abilities, how reparations or amends are made. So any gains in rights or status by Black Americans, the end of slavery, voting rights, Black Wall Street, they're met with systemic violence and political and economic oppression. So here's the thing. It's not like Black people did not try to create communities and accumulate wealth. That absolutely happened in the United States. It's just that it was met with violence and oppression every time it occurred. So a lot of folks, if you saw the TV show The Watchmen, did folks see that? Obviously it's a fantasy, it's a fictional thing, but it begins with the Tulsa Massacre, which was not fiction, I'm sorry to say, and that was the first time a lot of people were learning about that. But something like the Tulsa Massacre happened in many, many US cities where Black people had accumulated wealth and were business owners and had opened banks, and they were literally slaughtered and their businesses wiped out and their assets stolen as a result of, doing well. So this is important to remember when we talk about Black wealth suppression, is that Black wealth suppression, number one, was literal murder and constant terror. So Then we've got, as you can see here, I'm going to just, I'm going to move around this little circle in this, this image I've given you. The black codes from 1865 to 1968, right? You can think of this as slavery reimagined. It's the beginning of the prison industrial complex, that it stopped being okay to enslave people because they were black, but it was still okay to enslave them if they were prisoners, if they had committed a crime. And so what do you bet? Black folks were committed, were prosecuted for more crimes than white folks were. And we still see this today, right? When we talked about last week, we talked about adultification and how that influences Black girls. So for instance, you know, a Black girl might end up arrested on her school campus for fiddling with her cell phone and not putting it down when the teacher says to. Whereas a white student, of course, that would just be, that girl's being defiant and that girl needs to get to her next period math class, right? It wouldn't be the same kind of big issue. So there's a long historical precedence for this. Why does this matter? Well, look, of course, your ability to attain wealth is suppressed if you are in prison. Also, some of the things that folks were offered in the US were not offered to Black people. So the whole 40 acres and a mule idea, like even if we talked about reparations today as let's go back and give people what they would have been given at the time, imagine that 40 acres and a mule would be, you know, a significant bit of reparation. This is tricky, of course, because, you know, a lot of times they were giving away indigenous land that people already lived on. So that's a whole nother problem. So more Black prisoners meant more free labor and wealth suppression for sure. Hey, did you know Blacks were also refused loans at banks? And also were not included in things like FHA home loans when they were first created. So this is another form of wealth suppression. Did you know that most Americans, if they have wealth, right? And wealth, by the way, is not the same as income, right? Income is the money coming in. Wealth is the money that sits around. You know, so one of my favorite social theorists, Chris Rock, said it this way, that if, you know, Shaquille O'Neal, he's rich. The guy who gives Shaq the check, he's wealthy, right? So there's a difference between the paycheck you get and the wealth you have sitting around that you can use to buy things like sports teams. Yeah? So what I'm talking about is being able to accumulate wealth that hopefully most people hope will grow in value over time rather than shrink in value. So most Americans who have any wealth at all, they have it as a result of owning a home. That is just 100% across the board. Wealth is in home ownership in the United States. Yes, yes, it could also be in other kinds of investments, but home ownership is big. And so being barred from getting home loans is a big issue in wealth suppression. So the other thing, and now I'm down at the bottom left on that chart, the other thing is redlining. So wow, let's say you did actually own a home. Does the value go up in time? Now, most of us are used to the answer being yes. But the thing is, what banks did was to, you know, this makes sense, right? You're a bank, you want to protect your investment, and you're going to draw lines around the areas that are likely to increase in value versus the ones that are not. Now, I want to just tell you, it would make sense if a bank was, say, drawing a red line around low-lying floodplains, for instance, in terms of bad investment. But that's not what happened. What happened was that banks decided that certain humans would create a poor risk. So people of color in general, Black people in specific, were redlined. And this is still continuing today. So, for instance, oh, now I wish I had flagged this article to give you, but I didn't. For instance, let's say you want to invest in a neighborhood that is predominantly African American, and you're going to buy an apartment building, and it already has, 75% of those units are rented, that normally is considered an asset by a bank, right? There's already tenants in there. They don't let you claim all of it, but you can claim some of that income. Well, here's the thing. If that building is in a predominantly Black neighborhood and has been rented by a bank, chances are they are going to evaluate its worth near zero, right? Which means an entire building, not one that needs to be torn down, one that is 75% inhabited, is going to be ineligible for a business loan. So this is part of the way that redlining still functions, even though Black families now are able to apply for FHA home loans. All right, I'll say another couple of things here because, it's all terrible. It's all terrible. I mean, that's the truth of it. Property rights that have to do with heirs, that's a tricky one, right? So a lot of people die without wills, particularly people who are poorer. So there are alternatives to wills in certain states, Florida being one of them, that affect Black neighborhoods more than they affect white neighborhoods. And it is possible when people die that a will goes into probate, but the family members do not benefit from what was owned before them. It goes back to the state. This kind of heir property rights is an issue in states around the southern US, and it often leads to, even if you have a parent who owned property, when they die, it can revert to the state rather than being passed on to the next generation. Folks, that doesn't happen to white folks, right? And it certainly doesn't happen if you're able to hire an attorney. It doesn't happen if you have a will or a trust, but it predominantly happens to Black Americans. There's also a box there talking about white terrorism, some of which I have mentioned already. And there's also a box talking about neighborhood segregation. So, site selection for public housing is one of those issues. You may have noticed that unlike UK, for instance, that spreads out public housing all over a city, we tend to concentrate public housing in areas that already are likely to be, people of color live in there. There's also redlining and gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is that weird thing they do where they, draw political lines in order to benefit a dominant group. And here's the other thing about neighborhood segregation that is going to lead us to the next, and that is that it matters where you go to school. Where you live depends on where you go to school. And schools have never been equally funded in the United States. We have never once had a situation where school has been an equal situation, even though a lot of Americans think about school as the great equalizer. We think about schooling being the thing that's like, as long as you work hard and do well in school, you've got an equal shot to go to college and do these things. And no, that has never been true, right? If you are a person of color, chances are you live in a neighborhood with an underfunded school that does not have adequate classes and facilities to prepare you for a university education, and possibly does not even have adequate facilities to prepare you to graduate, right? Like, we are still working with 50 to 70% dropout rates in certain cities and certain communities. Okay. I'm gonna stop share right now, and you have access to this image, your own self that Emily can place in the sharing something, however you do that. And before
I dropped it in there, and Lizzie is asking, is it okay if I share this graphic on my social channels?
Yes, you absolutely can share that graphic wherever you would like, anybody. And I hope that you do share these things that I'm offering to you. Before I move on to talk about school vouchers, does anybody have questions? You can feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question regarding Black wealth suppression. And, I just want to say, I didn't mention other people of color, but look, we have a situation where since the beginning of our nation, there's a very interesting book out right now. I mean, just recently out by Isabel Wilkerson called Caste. She is framing our system of racial inequality in the United States in terms of a caste system. And so it's a useful framework, right? So if you think of Black people being at the bottom of that caste system, people of any other appearance, right, are coming into a nation where, or they were already here, where they have to figure out what is their relationship to whiteness and Blackness, and where do they fit. And so, most people, reasonably so, try to maximize privilege by identifying with whiteness as much as possible. And we can see how that has worked over time. Like, so, Japanese Americans owned plenty of businesses and farmlands before they were incarcerated in concentration camps and forever associated with people of color as opposed to white folks. So, that's tricky business. So a lot of that wealth suppression stuff applies to other people of color as well. All right, I'm letting there be a small pause before I talk about school vouchers. Hey, did you know that school vouchers also, the whole idea came from after Brown versus Board of Education made racial segregation in American schools illegal by law. Once again, people had to figure out, how do we do it anyway? Because even by 1954, people's ideas had not yet changed. And y'all remember, that wasn't very long ago. You have seen pictures and you've heard stories about how people did not want, white people did not want people of color coming to their children's schools. So that was the beginning of school vouchers. Was, hey, wait, I want my government to still pay for my child's education, but I want to choose how that child is educated. So on the surface, this is not a bad idea, right? It's not a bad idea. If the government is going to pay for universal education, which is the system we have now. By the way, that started in Massachusetts a while back. It did not begin at the beginning of our nation. Like, we have not always had a system of universal, free public education. But since we do, why not let people choose how their children are educated? So it's a good idea on the surface, but there are a couple of problems, and I'll just talk through a few of them. So one of the issues with school vouchers is that it promotes segregation, not just racially, but also in other ways. So about 80% of places that have school vouchers, right? Because not everybody uses, education is funded partially through the federal government, partially through states, and partially through local school districts. And so it's a complex set of rules that govern how education happens. And not everywhere has school vouchers available, but the places that do, 80% of them are used to fund religious education. So here's the deal. That's all nice and good that you want your children to learn about religion. But first of all, we have a rule already that says, hey, we have separation of church and state. Now, we all know that's hooey, actually, right? There is no separation between church and state, but I think it is a good idea that we try. Like, it is absolutely a good idea that we continue to try to separate church and state. So what ends up happening with religious education is that those schools that accept those vouchers do not need to adhere to the regular civil rights laws that our country has already established. So lack of separation between church and state is one of those issues. Hey, how about this? How about we don't let girls play sports at this school because that is not the proper role of girls? How about teaching specific gender roles in school? How about we don't allow LGBTQ students to come here, and we certainly don't hire teachers that might have a different sexual orientation? And you know, race is not so hip now to say, oh, we don't allow people of a certain race, but it's also possible that that private school doesn't allow people with a certain disciplinary background, which you are more likely to have on your record if you attend an underfunded school that uses policing rather than school detention. They can also keep people out if they perform poorly on tests. They can have academic standards that don't allow certain folks in. So I hope you're starting to see that one of the problems with this is that while public education accepts every child, private schools don't have to. They don't have to accept every child. And so what this means is that there's a whole population of folks who will never be able to use school vouchers. And especially for students that need special education, for students that live in rural communities and need to somehow get to school that is, you know, 2 hours away and there's no public transportation. These are the students that it is most expensive to serve. So what happens when they have no access to schooling through vouchers, and the school systems that previously were funded to meet their needs don't have the money anymore because of vouchers to, you know, to help those kids. So I might be in favor of school vouchers if they were funded in addition to solid public education funding. But that is not ever what we've been talking about. What folks talk about is how do we take the pot of money currently being spent on public education and carve some of it out for vouchers. And there's another issue with poverty that I didn't discuss, which is a private school can charge more than the voucher provides. And so if you are poor and let's say your voucher covers, you know, 60% of the school tuition and you can't make the other 40%, you also do not have access to using that voucher. There are more issues, and that's why I would like Emily to share with you a little fact sheet from the Association of University Women, which is an organization that does some really good research and puts out a number of really nice position papers on various policy issues that affect girls and women in particular. And this one does because, of course, those private schools are allowed to limit who they hire and to also enforce gender roles in ways that would not be possible in public schools because we've already had a civil rights movement and that has addressed some of those things.
I'm very close to finding it.
You're very close to finding it. So
Finding
I'll just
the
add,
doc.
yeah, I'll just add this as well.
Actually, Kimberly, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I don't see it. I don't see it in the Google Doc.
In the email that I sent you.
Hey, this is what we like to call exposed infrastructure.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
I see the, I don't know, maybe you didn't send it. I see the image that I shared.
I sent an email to you right before we started.
Right, I'd like to share this. I just think that maybe.
I'll find it myself.
You definitely sent the email.
Okay, let me not forget this point though.
Yes.
So, one of the other issues with this kind of private schooling is that those teachers also don't have to be credentialed. They don't even have to have a bachelor's degree, right? So schools can decide what kind of hiring they want to do, and often because they are, you know, religiously motivated, the training of those teachers is suspect. They also are not attempting to meet state standards. And when you look at overall, right, there are some private schools that are providing excellent academic education that accept vouchers. But when you look overall, those voucher receiving private schools are actually doing worse academically overall than public school is, which is saying a lot. Lizzie says she finds that insane. Wow, I do too. All right. I have found the link that I want to share with you. And it's happening now. I'll just stick it in there my own self. There we go. So that is from the AAUW, and you can read more about some issues related to school vouchers. So oftentimes politically, this is an issue that is framed as being about choice, and superficially it is. It's just that taking money away from already underfunded public schools is a way to make those schools worse for the people who are left behind in them. And that's a heck of a lot of people because of how those private schools don't have to accept everyone who comes. Does anybody have questions or comments about school vouchers or racial wealth segregation, suppression, because you're still thinking about that, aren't you?
I just want to make sure Lizzie's comment above, where she says maybe for another day, but can you also talk about the model minority? I just want to make sure that we capture that before.
Thank you, Lizzie. I would like to talk about that another day because I do have some interesting resources for that. I'll put it on the list. Anything else about these topics today? I want to say hi, Maribel. I know you're there. I see your name. That's nice.
Hello.
So listen, next week I'm going to be talking about gendered communication. And because that topic has a whole bunch of topics under it, that's kind of the only broad topic we're going to discuss, but that includes mansplaining and fempathizing and domination patterns in communications in the workplace and in the public sphere. And you might have noticed that some of that is relevant to our lives right now. It can't help but be relevant to our lives every day, actually. But that is what I'm going to be talking about next week. And this is the smallest group of people we've had so far. So please, you know, spread the word. You're welcome to invite whoever you'd like to these conversations. I'm happy to help.